Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're actually doing something a little bit different. We're going to bridge the gap between the incredibly chaotic, hyper-granular world of domestic U.S. elections and the grand, sweeping scale of the U.S.-China superpower race. Now, I know that sounds like a massive leap, but our source material today reveals this really brilliant arc. We're going to contrast the messy, everyday reality of American politics with the sheer structural resilience of its global dominance. So, let's unpack the myth versus reality of where the world is actually heading.
All right, let's just jump right in. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the midterm battleground. Second, polarization and controversial candidates. Third, we're looking at the declinism myth. And finally, we'll hit the hard US versus China data.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the midterm battleground.
So the big question kind of hanging over the whole political landscape right now is this. Are historical trends actually going to hold up this November? You know, the conventional wisdom in American politics acts almost like a law of gravity at this point. The in party, meaning the party that holds the White House, pretty much always loses seats in the House of Representatives during the midterms. We saw it clearly with Obama in his first term, and the general assumption has been that the current administration is going to face that exact same headwind. But in a political environment that's this highly charged, well, conventional wisdom is continually being put to the test.
To really understand just how heavy that historical gravity is, I want you to just wrap your head around this number, 3. The source points out that over the last 100 years of American political history, there have literally been only 3 occasions where the in-party didn't lose seats in the House. 3 times in an entire century. That sets up an incredibly tough historical precedent for any sitting administration to try and overcome.
And here is where the math gets absolutely razor thin. Out of the more than 400 seats in the House of Representatives, the map shows that only about 50 seats are truly in play, leaning slightly left or slightly right. But if we drill down even further into this analysis, the speaker notes that only 15 to 20 of those seats are actually in tight contention. Think about that. Just 15 to 20 seats are going to decide the entire balance of power. The margins are so incredibly tight that a shift of just 2 or 3 seats can completely alter the landscape.
Moving right along to Section 2, polarization and controversial candidates.
According to the source, rather than pivoting to the political center to try and capture moderate voters, which honestly is what a lot of people expected, there's a major trend of doubling down. The interview highlights a few specific examples to argue this point, claiming that parts of the Democratic Party in particular are really not moving to the middle. For instance, the speaker points to a Texas congresswoman making remarks about using ICE detention facilities for Zionists. They also mention a candidate up in Maine who reportedly has a Totenkopf tattoo, which is a symbol historically associated with the Third Reich. And they cite activists deliberately targeting Ken Griffin's personal home. Now, regardless of where you might sit politically, the source is using these specific, highly controversial examples to illustrate a broader claim, that our political environment is becoming increasingly isolated and polarized, rather than unified.
And throwing a giant tank of gas on this polarized fire is redistricting, which the source flat out calls a war. And right now, the mechanics of this war heavily favor one side. Because Republicans hold control of more state legislatures, the source's analysis, which is actually echoed by some opposing pollsters too, suggests this advantage could cost Democrats roughly 8 to 9 seats outright. On top of that, an upcoming Supreme Court ruling on racial gerrymandering might shift another 4 seats. When you remember what we just talked about, that only 15 to 20 seats are genuinely up for grabs, a structural shift of 12 or 13 seats purely from redistricting and court rulings, that is an absolutely massive deal.
Okay, let's totally shift gears here for Section 3, the declinism myth.
The second half of the source interview centers around an article with just a fantastic title, America, the Real Crouching Tiger Hidden Dragon. And this completely flips the dominant narrative on its head. In the West, we are constantly bombarded with these stories of American decline. This whole idea that the U.S. is peaked and is being rapidly overtaken by rivals, particularly China. While the source argues forcefully that this narrative is fundamentally flawed and that global elites are vastly underestimating America's enduring underlying strengths.
To understand why we always feel like we're failing, the speaker introduces this concept of declinism. They define it not as a reflection of actual physical weakness, but as a long-standing characteristic of free, self-critical Western societies. And get this, it isn't a new phenomenon at all. It's a habit that stretches back over 2,500 years. In a free society, constant self-criticism is just par for the course. It's loud, it's super messy, kind of like the midterms we were just looking at, but feeling like you are in decline is more of a cultural tendency than an inevitable reality.
To really back this up, the source looks at the long-term essentials for any society's success, starting with the absolute bedrock, constitutional stability.
The U.S. has maintained continuous constitutional stability for centuries. It's an unbroken line of governance. Now contrast that with China, which, according to the source, fundamentally lacks this deep-rooted constitutional continuity. That foundational stability is the launchpad for literally everything else a superpower does.
Which brings us right into Section 4, the U.S. versus China data.
Let's look at the hard numbers, because this brilliantly illustrates the stark reality of global self-sufficiency. Look at energy, for example. The U.S. is the largest producer of gas and oil in human history, while China has to import a staggering 10 million barrels every single day. What about food? Well, the U.S. is the world's top exporter, but China has to import 30% of its food. And then there's the fertility rate. While the West overall is aging, the U.S. sits at a pretty solid 1.7. China is at 1.0, which means an actively aging and shrinking population. So the baseline here is simple. The U.S. is highly self-reliant, while China is highly dependent.
And this massive gap extends powerfully into military capabilities too. The U.S. operates 11 carrier groups and has a full century, 100 years of experience running complex carrier operations around the globe. China, on the other hand, currently has 3 carrier groups and only about 15 years of operational experience. It is an absolutely enormous disparity in both physical naval capacity and strategic, real-world experience.
That strategic gap just continues when we look at nuclear arsenals and the frontier of innovation. The U.S. maintains a stockpile of roughly 6,000 to 7,000 nuclear weapons, compared to China's approximately 600. China is definitely actively trying to close this gap, but the distance between them is still vast. Plus, the source points out that the U.S. has actually regained the global lead in artificial intelligence, and when it comes to space exploration, between NASA and private entities like Elon Musk, who literally launches more satellites than most of the rest of the world combined, American dominance in space is incredibly robust.
And all of this culminates in the ultimate scoreboard, the economy. Think back to 10 years ago. The prevailing narrative warned us that China's economy would have easily surpassed the U.S. by now. But what's the actual reality? The U.S. annual GDP sits at roughly $30 trillion, heavily outpacing China's $20 trillion. The great economic eclipse that everyone predicted, it simply hasn't materialized.
To put that economic output into a more human perspective, the source offers this really fascinating bit of rough math regarding productivity. So the U.S. has a population of about 340 million people. China has 1.4 billion. According to the speaker's calculations, it takes about 4 Chinese residents to produce just 60% of the GDP that one single American produces. Now, the source absolutely acknowledges that China's advance from a primarily peasant society 50 years ago to where they are now is genuinely astonishing. But astonishing progress is not the same thing as achieving parity with the United States.
So we've traveled from the noisy, razor-thin, hyper-polarized battles of the domestic midterms all the way out to the silent, massive structural advantages of the American superpower on the global stage. And it leaves us with one incredibly provocative question. Are we underestimating the resilience of America's structural advantages? Because if you only look at the chaos of the elections, you might see decline. But if you look at the data, the foundation remains uniquely, incredibly strong. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this gave you a powerful new lens to view the news through today. Keep questioning the narratives, and I'll see you next time.